So today I'd like to make the case for a strong FCC, Federal Communications Commission, I assume most people know what that is, that's empowered to protect consumers and competition. One that has independent leadership and a staff dedicated to its responsibility, which is enshrined in law, to protect the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Without such an agency, large numbers of Americans not only will remain unconnected, but they won't have anybody to ensure that our communications networks are affordable, accessible, open, fast, and fair. Now, I didn't always feel this way. I spent the first 25 years of my career as a public interest advocate who denounced the FCC early and often. It was a captured agency, I said. It was opaque. It moved too slowly. It moved too quickly. It was timid. It ignored consumer interests. But on November 4th, 2013, new FCC chair, and I must say, Ohio State University, the Ohio State University graduate, Tom Wheeler, announced that he had hired me to serve on his senior staff. The New York Times even wrote about it. They wrote an article titled, "FCC Chief Hires a Critic of the Agency." Now, there was a period of adjustment for me at the FCC, but I soon learned that under the right leadership, the agency can be a force for good. While the Tom Wheeler FCC is perhaps best known, or notoriously known, depending on your point of view, for adopting the strongest ever net neutrality rules and restoring the agency's authority over broadband internet access, we accomplished so much more than that over 3 years, and I'm just going to set out some of these things. Modernizing the E-rate and Lifeline programs, reinvigorating the moribund enforcement and consumer bureaus, reforming intrastate prison phone rates, maintaining rules that preserve media diversity, developing the first ever incentive auction for broadcast spectrum, putting a halt to the Comcast Time Warner Cable and Sprint T-Mobile mergers, raising the speed requirements for broadband internet access, adopting broadband privacy rules, and while we eventually lost in court, and this makes me sad, preempting the laws of North Carolina and Tennessee that prohibited municipalities from building or expanding their broadband networks. Now, some of you may recall that when Wheeler was first nominated by President Obama to succeed outgoing Chair Julius Genachowski, there was grumbling by some of my public interest colleagues because Wheeler had been the head of the Cable Industry Trade Association in the 1970s and 80s, and the Wireless Industry Association in the 90s. What my colleagues didn't take into account was that Wheeler had led those industries when they were the new kids on the block. The incumbents at the time tried to hijack the regulatory process to stifle these new competitors in their cribs. Also, at the tender age of 67, Wheeler didn't need an FCC chairmanship to get his next job. The broadband, wireless, cable, and broadcasting markets that Tom Wheeler inherited at the FCC looked nothing like those of the 70s, 80s, or 90s. They were, and still are, enormously consolidated. And in the case of broadband and cable, either regional monopolies or duopolies. Their prices were, and still are, exorbitant. And they were used to getting their way at the FCC almost every single time. Wheeler's agenda reflected his desire to protect consumers and give them the benefit of what he called competition, competition, competition. Most importantly, Wheeler took the FCC from the biggest incumbents and gave it back to the American people. I really think it was, as a person who had done this work for 25 years, I think it was the first time that Americans kind of felt like the FCC was theirs, that they had a voice. And this was really, really important. His senior staff and bureau chiefs reflected this. He hired a diverse staff from federal, state, and local government, public interest, and private law practice, all of whom, and believe me, I got to work with every one of them, put the public interest first. Now, Tom Wheeler and his staff believed in the power of government to make life better for ordinary Americans. True, we weren't curing cancer or preventing climate change or improving our education system. But we were working to make sure that all Americans had affordable access to an open and decentralized communication system that could connect you to an oncologist, reduce your carbon footprint, and bring the classroom to your home. I think that's pretty important stuff. Since we're in Ohio, I'll tell you a story about one of your candidates for governor, Richard Cordray, who, as many of you know, also was the first head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The CFPB was created to protect Americans from predatory financial and banking practices, among other things. While Wheeler often broke bread with government dignitaries, it was his meetings with Cordray that he most talked about to his staff, because inevitably, the two of them would try to one-up each other as to who had done the most for consumers. I mean, it was like a boasting session, and I thought that was really pretty amazing. The Ohio connection didn't hurt either, but still. Imagine something like that happening today. Can you imagine Ajit Pai and Mick Mulvaney talking about who's done more for consumers? What's remarkable about Ajit Pai's FCC is not that it's inclined to deregulate. That's expected in a Republican administration. Elections have consequences. But that it's more than happy to abdicate the agency's power to oversee broadband internet access. In December 2017, as part of its decision repealing the 2015 net neutrality rules, Pai and his two Republican colleagues decided that the FCC would no longer protect consumers and competition in the broadband market. They decided that the agency, which for 84 years, since 1934, had been tasked with overseeing access to communications networks, would no longer oversee access to the most important communications network of our time, if not of all time. Now, this was a truly radical decision. While there has been disagreement over the past 20 years over how to codify net neutrality, should there be rules, should there be principles, should, that really didn't matter, okay? There has been bipartisan agreement that the FCC should have the authority and also the responsibility to protect consumers and competition in the broadband market. Now, Chairman Pai would say that I'm being hyperbolic. In his mind, he returned broadband oversight to the Federal Trade Commission, where it resided from 2005 to 2015. But the FTC's authority to oversee the broadband market is far more constrained than the FCC's. First, the FTC has no legal authority to make rules. It cannot, by law, make rules like the FCC can. And rules protect consumers before they're harmed. That's not insubstantial if you think about things like privacy, all right? Your broadband provider violates your privacy rules. That could have economic consequences, that could have social consequences, that could even have physical consequences. Rules also moderate bad industry behavior. Second, under the law, the FCC's power to protect consumers is limited to unfair and deceptive trade practices. This is the Federal Trade Act, which is like the the Communications Act of 1934 is the organic law that regulates the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC has interpreted this narrowly so that a consumer will only get relief if a broadband provider isn't transparent or is otherwise untruthful about its practices. So if Charter or AT&T tells you in its terms of service that it reserves the right to raise its prices at any time and then one day decides to triple them, the FTC will do nothing for you. Ask the FTC how many times it's brought an enforcement action against a broadband provider that didn't involve either deception or admission, and all you're going to hear is crickets. Last Friday, I attended a speech by outgoing FTC Commissioner and former acting chair Maureen Olhausen. In defending Pai's decision to give authority over broadband to the FTC, Olhausen gave a number of examples of the FTC protecting consumers, very impressive, except that none of them even involved a broadband provider. While the repeal of the 2015 net neutrality rules and the abdication of the FCC's authority over broadband has only been effective for a short time, we've already seen the damage it can do. Last month, as part of the lawsuit against the FCC's repeal order, the fire chief of Santa Clara County Central Fire Department submitted an affidavit alleging that for 8 months, and despite numerous complaints, Verizon continued to throttle the fire department's broadband service, which they used to coordinate responses to major emergencies, including the Mendocino Complex fire, the largest in California history. It wasn't until the fire department agreed to pay Verizon more than double of what they paid previously that their broadband was no longer slowed to dial-up speeds. Now, the story here isn't that the repealed 2015 net neutrality rules were violated when the fire department broadband was throttled. It appears that the fire department burned through its data, and I didn't actually mean to use the term burn, but I did, burned through the data that they paid for, and as a result, their speeds were slowed down. Instead, the problem was that for 8 months, the fire department had no recourse against Verizon. The newly freed from responsibility FCC wouldn't resolve their complaint, and so long as Verizon was clear about what the fire department was buying, neither would the FTC. Now, I find it telling that in the aftermath of this incident, which threatened life, limb, and property, neither the FCC nor the FTC made any public statement about the incident. Neither claimed that if only the fire department brought the matter to our agencies, we could have resolved it. Not a peep. Their silence is deafening, and an admission that the FCC's December decision has created a dangerous gap in oversight. I'm reminded of what Joni Mitchell sang in Big Yellow Taxi, and I would sing it for you, but as you can probably tell, I have a little bit of a cold. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what it's got, you don't know what you've got till it's gone? While the FCC isn't gone, yet anyway, its leadership greatly diminished the agency's ability to do its job. And my sense is that it's not finished doing so. Witness Chairman Pai's transparent attempt to destroy the Lifeline program, which provides broadband subsidies for low-income Americans. I fear that what happened in Santa Clara won't be the last time we'll miss having a fully empowered FCC with strong independent leadership, ensuring that consumers come first. Now, I don't like to finish my speeches on a sour note, and people always ask me, what can I do? So let me give you some suggestions. Call your member of Congress. Vote this November and in every local, state, and federal election. Every day my mother says, Gigi, what can we do about the situation in this country? I said, Mom, vote in November and get people to vote. Can't we do anything before that? No. No, we really can't. Okay? People have to vote. And I don't care which way you vote, but people, we have what, 25% voting in this country, 30% voting? It's shameful. And you don't make change unless you get to the ballot box. Recent polling has shown that a majority of voters will choose candidates based on their position on net neutrality, and policymakers know that their constituents are sick of slow, non-competitive, and high-priced broadband. So while your call or vote won't make immediate change at the FCC, new and stronger congressional oversight could make it much more difficult for the agency to weaken its protections for consumers and competition. Right now, that oversight is completely non-existent. So despite the events of the past 18 months, I'm able to get up every morning because I know that inevitably the pendulum will swing back. All I need is for good people like you to help me give it a push. Thank you.
Thank you, Gigi. We're going to have a short discussion, Q&A between the two of us, and then we'll open it up to anyone else who wants to ask questions. So Gigi's going to stand at the lectern to make sure people on the far side of the room can see her. One other note I just wanted to say, thank you, Audrey introduced me, but I wanted to note that I run a podcast called Community Broadband Bits. I've interviewed Gigi in past episodes. Many of the people in this room actually have been on there, so Ernie's been on twice, so take a look. Gigi, I was trying to figure out, there's so many things I wanted to start with, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on net neutrality because I think a lot of people in the room have already given it a lot of thought. So I did want to pose a leading question to you, though, which I sometimes, I get the impression reading the trade press that's really responsive to the cable and telcos, that net neutrality is something that was kind of invented in 2015 by you and Tom Wheeler because you wanted to regulate more things. And so I'm curious if you could respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's just completely untrue. I mean, this is what happened. In 2002, the FCC had in front of it the question of whether new cable modem service was a telecommunications service like DSL, or whether it was cable service like cable, or whether it was something else, okay? And that, Michael Powell decided that it was going to be an unregulated information service, okay? And that's really when the discussion, it was originally called open access, is what people called it. And I remember the coalition pushing for open access included Disney, Microsoft, AOL. Google didn't even exist at the time, right? So this notion that the providers of the on-ramp to the internet should somehow not discriminate against certain content, services, and applications has been around really since the early 2000s, really even before 2002, because there was a case wending its way through Oregon and the Ninth Circuit, similarly asking the question, what is this new cable modem service? So it's been around for about 20 years. So the notion that somehow this popped up in 2015 is nonsense. Now, what was different about 2015? The FCC tried in 2008 to enforce net neutrality principles against Comcast when it was prohibiting people from uploading the King James Bible and barbershop quartets. Okay, they basically, this was under a Republican FCC. Kevin Martin said, this is a violation of openness principles. Comcast went to court. The court said, you're not using the proper part of the Communications Act in order to do what you're trying to do. And I'm simplifying this as much as possible. So then Obama comes in, Janikowski comes in, he adopts rules. They were a little weaker than I would have preferred. But again, he kept broadband as an information service and not as a telecommunications service. And the court again said, I'm sorry, you're not grounding these rules in the proper legal authority under the Communications Act. And most people know this. Tom Wheeler didn't really want to say that broadband was a telecommunications service because he thought that all hell was going to break loose, that the world was going to fall apart. He didn't want to regulate broadband under Title II, but he came to realize that the only way the agency could sustain strong rules, the kind of rules he wanted, was to ground broadband in Title II. So that's the only thing that's changed, and that has freaked out the large ISPs for mostly made-up reasons. I mean, I think the reason they don't like it is because it does give the FCC the ability to determine when they are acting in an unjust and unreasonable manner. Now, I talked about how if Spectrum decided to triple its prices tomorrow, there's nothing the FTC could do about it. Under Title II, there is something the FCC could do about it. Now, it wouldn't set the price. It wouldn't say you have to charge $49.99, but it could say that that was an unjust and unreasonable practice. And I think that's really what the ISPs fear the most, is the breadth of authority under Title II, even though we refrained, or in parlance, forbore from applying the vast majority of Title II to broadband. So that's the only thing that was different, and that's the thing that seems to send the ISPs over the moon. They claim that it dampened investment, although if you look at the numbers, that's clearly not true. If anything, it increased investment. They just don't like the breadth of oversight that Title II gives the FCC.
So as we move away from the Title II discussion, I want to use it to springboard into what I think is one of the more important issues that is not widely discussed, and that's how the FCC deals with small entities. One of the challenges I think the FCC has faced in protecting the open internet is that small ISPs, private and public, not all public, but enough public to make it uncomfortable for traditional sort of allies, have lined up and said, we don't want the FCC to have this expanded authority. As I looked into it, to me, it did seem like, although I think the small ISPs were scared because of horror stories that had no basis in reality, they also had a very real critique, which is that the FCC is not an agency that is friendly to work with for small ISPs. I'm curious about your perspective on that from inside and outside, frankly.
Yeah, this is similar to the debate that's going on right now over whether Google, Facebook, and Amazon should be regulated, right? And whether they should bear more responsibility or have more liability for what people post on their platforms, right? Those guys have all the money in the world if somebody posts something, let's say, about sex trafficking. There was just a law passed saying that the platforms would be liable if there were sex trafficking posts on platforms. They can handle it, but the little guys can't. And it's similar. Now, I will say, just in a sort of an amendment to what you said, there was a letter with 43 small ISPs on it that said, we're fine with Title II. There are plenty of small ISPs that are fine with it because it constrains the big guys. That would be my argument back, right, is that it really constrains the big guys more than it constrains you.
I fully agree, and I'll note that in my experience, no small ISP wanted to engage in violations of net neutrality, but they were nervous about a number of things. One of them was, for instance, a fear that they would have customers that complained and they would have to adjudicate problems in DC, which might be thousands of miles away. And so I'm just curious for some reflectivity about how the FCC, if it is possible, and I'm worried that it's not, for the FCC to act in the interests of smaller ISPs.
I mean, it should. I think this is what Tom Wheeler was trying to do. He was trying to introduce the concept of competition into an agency that really had ignored it for very long, and this agency actually reversed some of the good things we did. So, for example, when we allowed Charter and Time Warner Cable to merge, we required the merged entity to build out into areas where it hadn't built before, okay, to actually, get people connected who weren't connected before. It's one of the first things that Gigi reversed. So, yeah, I think we came close. We could have done better. I mean, part of the problem, I do think, is, when you don't show up at the agency, it's hard for folks to know, what you really care about and what you need. And that's a problem of resources, without a doubt. But something that's important is to somehow make your voice heard. And perhaps we need to have, so Ajit Pai has started an Office of Economics and Analysis, to try to go to the Chicago School of Economic Analysis, which would probably favor the incumbents every single time. Perhaps the FCC needs to have an office that particularly serves small business and small ISPs. I think that'd be a good idea.
Let's get into the very existence of the FCC, because as you and I were just briefly discussing, you had founded Public Knowledge, and prior to going to the FCC, you were running Public Knowledge, a nonprofit organization in DC that I think is one of the most important fighting for small businesses in the innovative tech space and in consumers, subscribers. Now, you're hearing through your network there and perhaps elsewhere that there's a strong argument circulating among some that mostly the FCC basically is unconstitutional. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it probably is not that radical, but what the FCC does is unconstitutional, I would say. So this is,
I'm sorry, just to be clear, you're saying that they're saying the FCC, what it does is unconstitutional.
Exactly. So I wrote a piece, I do a good bit of writing. I wrote a piece for NBC News about why, from a telecom perspective, Brett Kavanaugh is such a dangerous nominee to the Supreme Court, despite all his many other problems. As he and a lot of folks is starting to kind of glom on among the right that an agency doesn't have the right to make rules unless Congress specifically tells them what to say. The way Congress makes laws is they make them very generally because they don't have the expertise. What does Congress know about telecom policy or environmental policy or any kind of substantive policy for that matter? Very, very little. But there's this new strain of thinking that Kavanaugh is part of. It's called the Major Rules Doctrine, that says any rulemaking agency that sets a rule that would have a major impact on the economy, it basically can't do that. That's unconstitutional. And that Congress must essentially specify every jot and tittle for such a rule. And that would really radically undermine the administrative state in this country. Now, do I think the administrative state is perfect? No. But the notion that Congress would have to decide the most minute details of policy in every substantive area, you know where that's going to lead. That's going to lead to no new rules at all. No energy rules, no environmental rules, no healthcare rules, no drug, federal drug rules. It will be Katie bar the door. So I think it's extremely dangerous, but unfortunately catching on.
You mentioned that you had increased the minimum definition for broadband while I believe it was 2015 early on. I've seen some people suggesting we need to revise it. Canada has gone to 50-10, I believe, as a target. I've seen some people suggest we could go for gigabit symmetrical, which I actually think would be inappropriate for a minimum definition of broadband. And so I'm curious what you think, having gone through it, not just thrown a dart at the dartboard. I assume that's not what happened. You went through a process of looking at what applications people are using, that sort of thing. What do you think the definition should be at today?
I think, it's funny, Encompass, which is one of the trade associations that represents what's left of the competitive local exchange carrier community, they've called for a gigabit symmetrical.
Okay.
I think it should be at least 100 symmetrical. You look, 25.3, that was, 5 years ago already, right? So it was 4 years ago. It was a while ago, and it was a compromise. Trust me, we would have liked to have gone higher than that. But it's past its prime right now. Interesting, though, this FCC was considering, they did not, but they were seriously considering lowering it. And there are those that had accused us of raising it to 25.3 because they said that we were trying to raise the speed so high that when we did our annual review of whether broadband is being deployed to all Americans on a reasonable, timely basis, we would find that it was not, and therefore that would be an excuse to regulate. Okay, so every year we did find out that broadband was not being deployed on a reasonable and timely basis. But that's because it wasn't. And 25.3, we said that 25.3 was basically, if you had multiple devices in the house, that was the bare minimum that you needed. So it was not results driven, but, as a result, we were able to be a little bit more activist than we might be otherwise.
So I'd like to, do we have a mic, Jeff, for the audience? Okay. There is a mic right here that you can run around with. I'll ask a last question while I look for hands in the audience. And that is, Tom Wheeler, I fear, he got the job because he was a big bundler for Obama. What are the odds that the next person that happens to be a big bundler for a candidate who's not Donald Trump, presumably, and gets that role is going to do as good of a job?
Yeah, I hope we're past that. One of the things that has happened in the last 5 years is that these issues have been core to what Americans care about. And I don't even know if you could say that 5 years ago. And they've caught the attention of people like Chuck Schumer, the majority leader. I mean, he's been really, really active in the legislative effort to get the 2015 rules restored. And in fact, the Senate passed a bill that would do that. The House has not yet. But, this is no longer kind of a secondary issue for people. It's a primary issue. I also think I hope if the next president is somebody, good, that they'll look, frankly, to Donald Trump. I'm not giving a political speech. I'm not talking about, I didn't say who should, okay? But thank you. Thank you.
We're trying to get a mix of questions, and I'm sorry if I'm failing to do that.
I'm answering his question. I'm sorry. He just asked me a question. I'm just answering it. Okay. I'm sorry. I apologize if I've offended you. So to answer your question, I think these questions have become so much more important in people's minds and to local communities that I'm hoping that the days of the president, whoever that president is, picking a big money bundler is over. That was the point I was trying to make. I don't really know why he was offended, but obviously he was.
So clearly, some people feel that this has been too much in one direction. I do want to take questions from the audience in which we can balance that out. But I'd also, let me ask if there's a question. While Jeff is walking there, I'll make a point, then I'll see how Gigi responds. Question right here. So that point is the CAF 2 auctions that just ended up. I just did a podcast with John Chambers. He believes that it was an incredible auction carried out under Chairman Pai, that the transparency was unprecedented, frankly. And so this is not an agency that's getting everything wrong currently.
Yeah, I don't disagree. You know, my biggest gripe with this agency's done a lot of things I haven't liked, okay? The Lifeline proposal, which I'm hoping is not going anywhere for a variety of reasons, I think is very destructive. What he's done to media ownership rules, essentially weakening them to a point where they're almost useless. I don't think that's good for local communities. I don't think that's good for the nation. But yes, there have been some things that he's done well. He's doing the spectrum auctions very, very well. He did CAF 2 very well. He's been putting out the decisions 3 weeks in advance in full form. That's a form of transparency that, frankly, I wish we had done. So, you know, I don't mean to stand up here and say that everything Tom Wheeler did was perfect. One of the things that I wish he had done was require internet service providers to give more granular data on where they serve, as opposed to census block data, along with the price. I could not convince him to do that. I'm not sure Ajit Pai is going to do that either, but no administration is perfect. But I do take great umbrage, having worked so hard on the net neutrality decision, and again, to me, it's less about the prohibitions against blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization, and more about essentially stripping the agency of any ability to protect consumers and competition. And that's what I try to keep reminding people. That's really the nut of what this chairman has done. And you know, it's one thing, again, to say, I'm not going to use that power, but it's another thing to say, I'm going to give it to another agency. I just think that's radical, and that I'm not going to change.
I think you have to talk up a little bit. I'm not sure the mic is on.
So the Connect America Fund, which doles out $4 billion annually for rural broadband, when it was set up under Wheeler, it only required 10-1 service. Was that an issue of discussion of why it only required 10-1 versus the higher speed at the time, which was 25.3 with broadband?
Yes, we discussed it a lot, and obviously, you know, it looks like there's an inconsistency, and there is an inconsistency. I think the decision was made ultimately that, you know, 10-1 was just going to be the bare minimum, and that folks should aspire to be higher. Although we also felt that if we required, at least at the time, 25.3, that we would not be getting the money out to as many places as we wanted to. I think we were just being realistic.
Additional questions?
You had mentioned about the FCC action to preempt the state laws, Tennessee and North Carolina not being overturned by the courts. What is the current state of the law in terms of what the FCC is saying now about federal authority on state matters?
Well, it's interesting. You know, Chairman Pai and Commissioner O'Reilly both dissented vigorously from our preemption of those laws. And I'll be honest with you, you know, when we decided to preempt those two laws, we knew it was going to be a difficult haul in court. We knew it was not going to be a slam dunk because Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 gives the FCC certain powers in order to get broadband deployed to to all Americans. But preemption is not specifically mentioned. Okay, it says among other things, but it's not specifically mentioned, and that's the point. We lost that in the federal courts. Now, this FCC is very fond of preempting states and localities. on other things. For example, there's going to be a decision that comes out tomorrow that is going to limit state and local power when it comes to determining, where antenna, 5G antennas, any 5G deployment. They're basically deciding to put the big foot down. Similarly, with net neutrality, the repeal decision preempted any state laws that put into place net neutrality principles. Now, some 30-some-odd states have either passed or introduced net neutrality laws or executive orders which require the government to only work with ISPs that abide by net neutrality principles. And California passed, and if Governor Brown doesn't sign it in the next 5 days, it will go into law, net neutrality rules that are even stronger than the 2015 rules. So that preemption principle is going to be tested very, very soon. Yeah, so they like preemption when it has a more deregulatory effect, although I would say that getting rid of those state laws was deregulation, right? I mean, you were taking away a limitation on enterprise. So, yeah, they like preemption when they like it, and they don't when they don't.
Do you fear at all, someone on the mixer, I assume will get this mic going again. Do you fear that the FCC could do anything to stop municipalities, or is that ship passed?
Stop them from building.
Right, can the FCC reach past the states to require or to stop cities from building networks?
I think they'd be insane to do that. I don't think so. I mean, this chairman, the first thing out of the box was saying, we want to connect everybody, right? And while I think, with some exceptions, a lot of it is mostly talk, to do something like that, I think would cause an uproar. And again, the change in atmosphere, even from when we made that decision of senators and governors and mayors being supportive of having more broadband and knowing what it does, the economic vitality of a community and a state, I just think that would be political suicide. So like I said, I don't like a lot of what the chairman is doing, but I don't think he would do that. That's just too much. No, I'm not a commissioner, but thank you. Thank you for elevating me.
I was wondering your opinion on possibly bringing back the Commerce Clause. This would be bundling the ISPs, keeping the carriers separate from information and advertising provision, and vice versa. It seemed to work in other industries, but they got away from that, and now we've got extreme combinations and mega corporations, and it's almost like we've hit some point in time.
Yeah, I think you're talking about structural separation. And again, there's a lot of talk about that with regard to some of the big tech companies that are out there, more than there are with regard to broadband companies. Look, I think the preference is to try to create conditions that will allow for more competition. And, one of the top things on my list, again, is those 19 states that have laws that prohibit municipalities from building their own broadband networks or expanding their networks. That's stupid policy. That's, policy that the incumbent ISPs got passed in local state legislatures, and it needs to go. I also think that's something we ought to be thinking about again, which I think worked very well in the late 90s and early aughts, was local loop unbundling, right? Requiring the dominant provider in a community to share its network with competitors. I mean, this is what a lot of the open access networks are doing, and I want to go to the session at 340 to see how well it's working, but I think we need to reconsider that. That was also a third rail. Title II was a third rail, and we did forbear when we adopted the 2015 net neutrality rules from unbundling rules, but I think we need to rethink that because, as I said before, we're really stuck for the most part in most communities. I mean, I guess I'm lucky in Washington, I have a choice of 3, but most people are stuck with 1 or 2. I think it's the latest numbers from the FCC are, I believe it's something like almost half, like 47% have only 1 broadband provider available to them, and 78% have 2. That's not a situation where competition is thriving, and we need to think of other ways to promote that.
We recently ran the numbers, and I believe Charter has 30 million captive broadband customers, and Comcast has 38 million with no choice. So,
And I'm open to other ideas. I mean, if there's, like I said, because you use the term unbundling, and, the folks at the big ISPs, their heads pop off. But if people have other ideas for how you get to that, where, somebody is providing, the main network so others can come in and provide last mile service, that to me is ideal. I mean, that's what we had when the average American had a choice of 13 ISPs. We've obviously gotten very, very far away from that.
and with that, I think we can wrap up. Thank you, Gigi, for speaking and answering questions.
Thank you all.